All right. I'm going to say something before this comes on. I just watched just like 5 seconds of what I'm going to record here before it come on. This is not a prediction, but I'm going to say that if Donald J. Trump, even though he has made a mess out of his political career, if he's got a chance in becoming elected president again, it will be through the evangelical Christians, because they know that they have been beat up on. The Christians knows that if they don't have a strong voice out there, that they may not make it, because of all these other different movements that's going on in the world that's actually going up against Christianity. So if you don't mind, please forgive me for sneezing. I just was outside just for a second. Our leaves and stuff are really falling right now because of the fall and winter months.
We're going to protect Christianity, and I can say that. I don't have to be politically correct, or we're going to protect it. You know? And I asked Jerry and I asked some of the folks, because I hear this is a major theme right here, but 2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17, that's the whole ball game. Where the Spirit of the Lord, right? Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And here there is Liberty College, but Liberty University, but it is so true. You know, when you think, and that's really, is that the one? Is that the one you like? I think that's the one you like.
It was the mistake heard around the evangelical world. In 2016, Donald Trump attempted to cite a Bible verse following the advice of Tony Perkins during an appearance at Liberty University. The gaffe led the future president to harbor resentment toward the evangelical community for years, despite being the key voting bloc that propelled him to power. Joining us now to explain is staff writer for The Atlantic, Tim Alberta. He is the author of the new book, entitled The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory: American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. I'm fascinated and frightened by this issue, Tim. I'm really glad you wrote this book. First of all, tell us about the inspiration for the book.
Thanks, Mika. Thanks, Joe, for having me. Yes, the inspiration for the book, look, I grew up evangelical. My dad was a pastor in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. That's my faith background. That's my faith community. And I grew up literally, physically inside the church. My mother was on the staff there as well. That was my home. It was my family. As I grew older, even though my relationship with Jesus never changed, I really started to feel my relationship with the church changing, and really became disillusioned with sort of institutional Christianity, so much of which in the American context was wrapped up in sort of nationalist ideals, political zealotry, political hypocrisy, and I sort of kept those concerns at bay for as long as I could. I really did kind of turn a blind eye to it, which in retrospect I feel sort of guilty about. But ultimately, when my dad died, it really forced me to re-examine some of this, in part because, as you teased earlier, I had some people basically confronting me at his funeral. When I went home to Michigan, basically wanting to use his funeral to confront me and argue with me about Trump and about politics and all of that. And that was kind of the moment for me when I just realized that something had really, really gone wrong here, and maybe I should do something about it.
What happened at the funeral? You say someone passed you a note, or what was the confrontation?
Well, so as it happens, I had actually just written my first book that was about Trump's takeover of the Republican Party just before my dad died. That was the last time I saw my dad, was when the book came out. And so I was sort of in the crosshairs of right-wing media at the time, including Rush Limbaugh. So at the visitation for my dad when I went home, there were people coming up to me and saying, "Hey, Rush is ripping you on his show. You know, what's going on with you? Are you still a Christian?" That sort of thing. And then it was sort of escalated escalating from there to the point where the next day in my eulogy, I kind of let people have it a little bit and said, like, what are we doing here? Like, what, Rush Limbaugh, like in the church? Like, is this who we are? And I thought it was finished at that point. And then I was handed a note after the eulogy, after we buried my dad, actually. And basically the note from an elder in the church, someone who was a close friend of my dad's, who I'd known since I was a little boy, basically said that I was a part of the deep state and that I was betraying the church, betraying the country, and that I should beg for forgiveness. And I have not begged for forgiveness. Obviously, I've chosen to go a different route here. But really, I'm, if anything, I'm just trying to help reclaim the church's true identity from, you know, this sort of hijacked, nationalized version that we're witnessing now.
Tim, such an extraordinary and terrible moment. I was lucky enough to receive an early copy of this. It's great. People should pick it up. Congrats to you. Talk to us a little bit, though. I mean, it seems that Trump is such an unlikely fit for this community. He sort of alluded to it himself in that clip we played a moment ago. But he was seen as sort of a means to an end. They were able to get what they wanted. But explain to us a little more about that, but also his hold on it, his persistent as being their choice, despite all that we know he has done since taking office.
Yeah, John, look, it's easy to forget now, but in 2015, early 2016, Trump was the last choice of all of these white evangelical voters in the Republican primary. And even after Trump had clinched the nomination, there was a tremendous amount of resistance to the point where Trump had to go to New York and meet with about 500 major evangelical ministers. And he had to have the endorsement of Jerry Falwell Jr. and Mike Huckabee and Franklin Graham and some of these other leading evangelical figures to really vouch for him. And then he chose Mike Pence, and then he released his Supreme Court list. All of this was aimed at assuaging the concerns of the evangelical movement. And basically what you saw in 2016 was a lot of these voters entered into a transactional relationship with Trump where they said, look, we don't trust this guy. He's not one of us. We know that he doesn't share our values. But if we give him our votes, then he will deliver us these policy victories. That transactional relationship has now morphed into something entirely different. And I think the best explanation for this unflinching, unwavering support that we see, that you described, is for a lot of these folks, a lot of these voters, they truly believe at this point that the end is near, that America, as they've known it, is under attack, that the country is on its last legs, that the secular, leftist, government, deep state, whatever you want to call it, is coming for them, coming for their churches, coming for Christianity. And that sort of creates a permission structure for them to almost rent out Trump as a mercenary to protect Christianity, to fight for them in ways that no good Christian ever would. And so it's almost a little bit like when George W. Bush said that to protect the free market, that he had to first jettison free market principles with the bank bailout. This is sort of a similar thing where a lot of Christians say, look, in order to preserve Christian virtues in this country, maybe we first have to do away with Christian virtues.
There's something else in the Corinthians.
I want to weigh in on what they're talking about. First of all, it was very, very influential in the church communities because at that time, I've used this as an illustration, the church was basically asleep at the wheel up until Donald Trump became president, because before he became president, it had gotten to the point that if you even put out a lascivity scene of Christmas out in your yard and you was advertising in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, Virgin Mary, Joseph, pertaining to the virgin birth, you was prone possibly either getting ridiculed or ordered by the county or city or whatever of removing it, or somebody was liable to vandalize your property because of it. In other words, the church had been asleep at the wheel, and now all of a sudden, I've used this analogy, it's as if you was in a coliseum with 50,000 people, and all of them run down to the bottom of the football field at one time because they awakened in understanding that they was in trouble. Well, the Christian society actually come to the rescue a little too late, because you keep in mind it wasn't but about a year and a half into President Trump's presidency What slapped us all in the face? COVID. The very sickness of COVID. And we went from a country of about $27 trillion in debt to a country that's now over $33 trillion in debt because of the initial stages of COVID, all the other catastrophes that's been bombarding America pertaining to the forces of nature. But it was the Christian society, by and large, that refused to accept that climate change pertaining to global warming was in fact real. In other words, they was a day late and a dollar short. But I will admit this, whenever Donald Trump did come on board with his megaphone, he opened up a whole brand new horizon for the Christian society, to where basically all these antichrist people and all these occultist people and all these other type of people basically took back seat to the Christianity movement, because at that point in time, you could put out a lascivity scene and you didn't have to worry about somebody either vandalizing your property or getting the county mayor or the city mayor to have it removed. It is the church community that has been asleep at the wheel on cruise control, and they have awakened, and now they realize just exactly what kind of mess that we are in. And it basically took COVID and Donald Trump to wake them up over here in the western continental United States. Now, where the corporate church communities go from this moment on is another $64,000 question, because if they're not willing to accept the whole truth rather than just bits and pieces of the truth that the windmill ministries have been involved in towards preaching to them for quite some time, then they're still going to take second seat in comparison to all the hate mongers and all the occultists out there that are basically standing up. And we see this since the war broke out over in the Holy Land, pertaining to people that's standing up, that's siding with Hamas versus siding with Jerusalem, even though it was like 1,500 people that got massacred, murdered, raped, and it was put on, a lot of them was put on social media platforms for their loved ones to watch and to receive. The church is under attack right now. And we have known this even way before Trump ever become president, pertaining to all the shootings and the killings. Whenever somebody's bold enough to walk into a sanctuary, like over in South Carolina, whenever Obama was president, and he started singing Amazing Grace or something like that, the church community, by and large, has lost its influence with the world, to the point that now people think that they can just do the Christians any way they want to. Well, that's what they thought right here on this property pertaining to the Windmill Ministries, until after my brother died in 2017. And then I prayed a prayer, God, you're going to have to defend me because of this, because obviously I don't have the right type of people in the courts of Weakley County to defend me. And as far as I was concerned, they was a contributor to my brother's death. And that's whenever I started seeing people in the neighborhood dropping like flies. And I hate to be cold about it in that sense, but I started seeing people having heart attacks, aneurysms. I started seeing people having bad episodes in their lives. I started seeing houses being blowed up and because of meth makers and people running into bridges and trees and everything else. And finally, they got the message of leaving the Windmill Ministries missions alone. Now, it took a while for that example to finally get ahead. But to this day, they don't run up and down the road screaming and hollering and falsely accusing me of being a pedophile or me having sex with my brother, or even greater than that, pertaining to right after my brother had died and accusing me of my own brother's death. You talk about a bunch of cold, callous, cruel individuals that was involved in that. I couldn't go no further than a bunch of people that's willing to do somebody that was raised in the neighborhood. And the thing about it is, we got deep roots here in this area that goes all the way back to the early 1800s, long about the time of the Davy Crockett era, long about the time of 1811, 1812 earthquake. That's how deep my roots go pertaining to my lineage of my people. So, the Christian society has really, really brought this upon to themselves because of the hypocrisy that began with the Christian society in the late 80s pertaining to Ronald Reagan, that was motivated by the Holy Spirit because of 9 tapes going to the White House of expressing to the political arena at that time that the world was not going to be destroyed by nuclear holocaust, but it was going to be destroyed the way that God intended for it to be destroyed in regards towards biblical Bible prophecies. And the whole time, while the founder of the Windmill Ministries has been going out here putting out his message, he has been under attack himself again and again and again. And I got documentary to prove it. I can authentically prove my testimony beginning in 1983 of me talking about the Antichrist and one world government and the New World Order over in a little town that my mother was raised up in called Kenton, Tennessee, less than 10 miles from where I live right here in Obion County. In addition towards what went on in my life in 89, whenever Homeland Security, Secret Service decided to intervene into a ministry in Madison County, Jackson, Tennessee, and confiscate something from the ministry that did not belong to them, that they themselves was in violation of my own amendments, my own rights. They didn't have no right in intervening while I was driving around with the Apocalypse model in the back end of my truck, but they did. Why? Because the whole movement began in the White House in 1988, whenever those 9 tapes circulated to Ronald Reagan's administration. That movement began then towards, hey, we're going to do away with this, we're going to do away with this prophecy, and we're going to do away with this individual and what this individual is involved in. That way, we can destroy his credibility, and that way won't nobody listen or have anything to do with him. That's what the resistance movement started in the late 80s. And today, we can see with my testimony of how many churches that basically kicked me to the curb. Even whenever I come back here in 2014, in 2015, I was receiving all kinds of resistances, either in Obion County, Weakley County, Madison County, or various places around here. I was receiving resistances because of the spiritual warfare. Now we can sure see, with all the killings, all the mass murders. So I'm going to go as far to say, because, it was the church community that was really standing up, that was saying, hey, they stole the election. And I don't know to this day that a great deal of them that claim to be Christians has yet accepted the truth that the election was actually stolen. One of the first people that I was talking to was some ministers over here in Greenfield that was talking about the voting process being rigged pertaining to, I don't forgot the name of it now, but it had to do with the system itself being tainted, that they was convinced, or these people that I talked to was convinced that that's what actually occurred, that the election had been stolen. And they were just waiting for basically Donald Trump to be liberated pertaining to the election. You keep in mind there's a lot of so-called Christians that claim to be Christians that go deep down into their heart. They're really not Christians. They just claim to be Christians. That's the reason why that the Windmill Ministries missions never took off the way that it should have had, was because after they got to recognizing the severity and the depth of what the ministry was promoting, that's whenever they gave me the cold shoulder and kicked me out to the curb. I was basically treated as an outcast. The same as other ministries that have come forth. And I'm gonna just use this right here for an example of Martin Luther of the Catholic Church that did not agree with all their theology, and because of it, they almost killed him, just like they almost killed me. And they did kill Jesus because he was the main ramrod that had to go in and conform Judaism religion of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This thing has been a struggle now for thousands of years. Not just in and of the period or the era of Jesus Christ, but you can go back into Moses, you can go back into Abraham, you can go back into Noah, and you can see where the true Christian society has been misled or deceived or tricked and attacked again and again and again. And of course, proof is in the pudding towards what has recently went on just within the past, 6 weeks over in the Holy Land. And of course, whenever you get to looking at all the resistances all over the world with all these different movements that's degrading Jerusalem towards them, not having the right to defend themselves. And I'm not saying that everything that Jerusalem has done in the past 30 years has been politically correct. But once more, I have to go back to what President Putin said whenever it first erupted over there, that it's the Western world's fault, and it really and truly is, because it was the Western world that wanted to conform the world in the one world government policy, but they wasn't wanting to do it authentically through a united Holy Ghost revival. They was wanting to conform various people in various countries the way that they thought that it was supposed to have been conformed. And of course, we see where Afghanistan, of us spending as much time and much money and lives and stuff that was sacrificed, and then 11 days later, we walk away. And the people that we thought that was conformed in standing up for their own selves surrendered to the very enemy that we had trained them against. Once more, you cannot approach this situation the same as Jesus Christ used an individual as being a cup towards trying to clean the outside of the cup, hoping that the inside would take care of itself. It has to begin from the inside. And even those that are very, very sincere, including myself, I still find struggles because of the temptations that are so powerful and so strong today, like never ever before. You keep in mind that even whenever Jesus, go back 2,000 years, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have running water, we didn't have automobiles, we didn't have all these chemicals, we didn't have all this medication, we didn't have all these influences like we do today. So the powers of Satan has grown tremendously just because of the movement of technology. But the supernatural powers has intensified, just as the Bible talks about, towards Satan coming down in great wrath, because he knoweth his time is short, in seeing all these mass murders over here in America and all the other illegitimacies that's going on in basically destroying our communities, destroying our churches, destroying our established churches. So the church world actually brought it upon to themselves because they was not willing to listen, they was not willing to conform, and they was not willing to accept the message coming from the messenger, which is myself, pertaining to the Windmill Ministries missions. And until they do, they can put in all the Donald Trumps that they want. Okay? Until they do, they can try to conform other people from the outside in versus the inside out, and they're going to get the same results again and again and again. Because right now, the church world, and I hate to say this, but it's true, are being ravaged. Because it was the church world that has allowed for all this stuff to bombard us the way that it has. It hasn't been until just within the past year and a half, 2 years, of me speaking out as much that I speak out on pertaining to artificial intelligence, that our country over here has now started putting various policies and started looking at social media and just exactly the dangers involved in what it's creating. And I'm just not talking about peer pressure. I'm not just talking about suicides. I'm talking about divorces. I'm talking about people basically at one time used to be a Christian, a true blue 100% Christian, born, sold out, hook, line, and sinker, that are now deviating or compromising on their walk with the Lord because of social media. And I can honestly say that about myself because those are some of the struggles that I am struggling with pertaining to the temptations that are now so easily accepted. It's bad. And the church world is under attack. It's a siege. It's a spiritual demonic siege that we have seen again and again and again throughout the history of our planet, of various Christian societies, regardless whether it was Moses' society or Jesus' society or other examples of other movements like Martin Luther or the movement of the Crusaders that went around killing Christians because they wouldn't convert, and that in and of itself is wrong. Kind of like the Muslim religion. There's nowhere in the Bible where it talks about that if you can't convert your converts, to kill them. There's nowhere in the Bible that it talks about that. A matter of fact, it says just the opposite. It says if they won't receive you, if they won't accept you, turn, shake the dust off your feet, and move on, for it would have been worse for Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, that's the era that we're in right now because of the rejection. They wouldn't listen. They wouldn't take heed of the messenger's message. They thought that this was some sort of a hoax. Thank God that I'm still living and I can tell my side of the story now pertaining to what the church world has brought upon to themselves. And whenever they brought it upon to themselves, they brought it upon to the non-Christians too as well. A matter of fact, it's the non-Christians that has got the upper leg right now on the true Christians because of all the evil and all the wickedness that's going on in our country that 25, 30 years ago, it existed, but not like it does today. Not nearly like it does today.
Corinthians, the former president tried to kind of jumble that. That is, evil communications corrupts good manners, which is, which is what we see from the former president. I think what you're sort of getting.
Our idle hands is a devil's workplace. You got all these people now that refuses to work because they rather sit around and tap around on their phone. Idle hands. Instead of being productive, getting out here and doing productive either by using their mind or using their body, they'd rather just be basically loafers and not do nothing.
Here is Christian nationalism, right? I haven't read the book yet, but I read the piece that you put out in The Atlantic about it that ended with the pastor who took over for your father who was trying to fight the takeover of Trump in the church. You asked him what's happened to the evangelicals in America, and he said they love America too much. It's like is that what we're dealing with here? Is this what the evangelical, or at least for some evangelicals that are supporting Trump, morphed into Christian nationalism?
I think so. And listen, Christian nationalism is a loaded term, and it means different things to different people. So I think clarifying in this context what the definition is helpful. At the end of the day, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you are called to a citizenship in heaven, and you are called to be a part of the kingdom of God. And we are warned as Christians throughout Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, prayers and epistles, all the way through. It's not ambiguous that your identity is rooted in heaven. Your identity is rooted in following Jesus. Unfortunately, I think this love of country, which can be healthy to a point, over-realized among some of these evangelical Christians, has sort of merged two kingdoms into one, and has created this belief that somehow, if America falls, then God himself is defeated. When, again, as Christians, we believe that Jesus triumphed over the grave, so there is no such thing as defeat. But when you begin to think of America as almost this covenant nation, that God has ordained us, God has blessed us, and you are fighting for God by fighting for America, that is Christian nationalism, and that is what has infected much of the church today.
Tim,
And I continue to keep talking about the corporate church. The corporate churches that has allowed for sin to come into their sanctuaries to the point that they no longer teach righteous living. They teach, as long as you believe in Jesus Christ, you're okay. You can slip around and cheat on your wife and cheat on your husband, cheat on your income tax and be dishonest and do this and do that. What did Jesus say about that? He said, for if the salt has lost its potential, or if it has lost its gravity in what salt was designed for to begin with, he said it's worthless. It just as well as be trampled down by the foot of man. And that's what's happening in our churches today. And that's the reason why so many of them have been blinded. And it hasn't been just within the past, I guess, year and a half, 2 years, that I've had certain people that started to pay somewhat of close attention to some of the things that I'm talking about. But as far as actually seeing a grand movement, I still ain't seen that. And if that be the case, well, then they're basically digging their own holes. And it's not that the kingdom of God is going to lose. I promise you, the kingdom of God will not lose. Those that's going to lose are those on the planet right now that could have had an established bride to the degree of seeing the true meek blossom out the way that the meek was supposed to have blossomed out, and because of it, we're not seeing the church blossoming. We're actually seeing the church being ravaged again and again and again and again. God ain't going to lose. It's going to be the church world down here that right now is losing because of seeing all the sin, all the wickedness, all the drugs, all the gun violence, all the other stuff, $33 trillion in debt. I mean, we're at the brink seeing, we had a pandemic that destroyed over 1 million lives within the first year and a half, 2 years of COVID. And it's still dictating in our land towards people still dying of COVID. I think the last time I heard was something like 5,000 a week or something like that. I may be wrong about that. It's slowed way down in comparison to what it was, but it's still out there, along with everything else.
Up in the Southern Baptist Church, the golden rule was one of the earliest things they teach you. Do unto others as they would have you do upon them. What would Jesus do was just the catchphrase for the 90s. Kindness. That's why I'm just reeling a bit by your experience at your own father's funeral. being confronted by someone who was a close family friend and who you had known your whole life. That wasn't the golden rule in practice. That wasn't what would Jesus do. I don't think that Jesus would, harass a grieving son. It's almost just so, it's smaller than the big picture of what happened to evangelicals when it comes to, broader virtues and moral society. How has Trump changed just our basic kindness?
I think what we have to understand in the context of Trump and his relationship with evangelical voters is that in many ways, one of Trump's enduring legacies, politically and otherwise, is going to be how he has sort of reconditioned the evangelical expectation of what a political leader should be. So, for example, when you look at Mike Pence's presidential campaign floundering the way that it has, I have this memory from a couple of summers ago when Donald Trump went to the Faith and Freedom Coalition gathering in Nashville, Ralph Reed's annual shindig, where Trump, for the first time publicly, really lit into Mike Pence and just let him have it in front of this ballroom full of a couple of thousand evangelicals who were Mike Pence's people, right? And the crowd went crazy, booing Pence, jeering him, cheering for Trump. And when you look at the collapse of Mike Pence's presidential campaign, I was with him at a rally once where he described himself as Rush Limbaugh on decaf, talking about his days in talk radio. And one of these Christian activists came up to me afterwards and said, "Decaf? We don't need decaf. Like, this country is about to collapse, and they are coming for the church. We don't need decaf. We need the real thing. We need all the caffeine we can get." So I think in some sense, as I said, Trump's enduring legacy with the church and with the evangelical vote is that he has conditioned them to expect a pugilism, an antagonism, a hostility that, of course, is completely abiblical and is antithetical to the teachings of Christ. And yet, you have this new standard set, and someone like Mike Pence, even someone like Ron DeSantis, they simply can't pass muster.
All right, Tim, I'm just curious because with this issue at The Atlantic that your editor, Jeffrey Goldberg, is putting together, it's really talking about what Trump second term would look like and the dangers of it. And one of the things we were talking about earlier in the show is normalization and how some of the worst things that Trump says and does are becoming so normalized in American society and in the electorate. But with evangelicals, isn't the evangelical community supposed to be the strongest when it comes to their core values as followers of Jesus Christ? Like, how exactly did this happen? How can they answer to supporting a man that is antithetical to to what it means to follow Jesus Christ?
They become too liberal. And like I told you, I have been told by others, expressing to me, even out in Phoenix, Arizona, working for a supervisor that had found out about my theology. And it's really not my theology, it's just the fact that I'm teaching the whole Bible versus only bits and pieces of it. He looked at me, he said, your religion is too rich. It's too serious. He said, that's the reason why people have scourged you. That's the reason why that they have gotten away from you and they didn't support you, was because of the intensity of what you're preaching. Well, whenever the Bible talks about in the first 4 chapters of Revelations to be thy faithful unto death, first of all, that is not my message. That is not my message. I'm only the messenger. The message was given to John the Revelator on the island of Patmos about, I guess, 35, 40 years after the death and the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. All I am is the messenger revealing the messages. And whenever you have a bunch of people that's so brainwashed in the Bible Belt area that continues to keep saying, oh, we're not going to be here whenever that happens. We're not going to be here whenever that happens. They're basically deniers in believing the whole truth, only wanting to believe part of the truth. That is one of the reasons why that it has been such of a uphill battle for the Windmill Ministries missions of the founder of it, which is talking right now, for him to get an upper toehold as far as going through the front door versus having to go through the back door with this particular message. And they still, to this day, are hypocrite about it, because they'll tell you, oh, no, we don't have no hate in our heart for Juby. Oh, no, we want peace. But yet, no, I do not see a manifestation of revival surrounding the Windmill Ministries mission. So because of it, what other else am I going to say other than you're full of it? You're still a hypocrite, and you're still deviating from your responsibilities, because once they identified my sincerity and my passion of me being so forward in the eyes of the general public, that's whenever the church world should have supported the Windmill Ministries missions. I have said this before. The founder of the ministry did not fail the Windmill Ministries missions, because I'm still speaking on behalf of that ministry. It was the people, the churches, that failed the ministry, not the ministry that failed the people. They have brought this upon to themselves because, once more, it was too rich. It was too serious. I've actually had people come up to me and say, well, you're like the little farmer that's feeding his cows, and instead of you feeding a little hay here and a little hay there, or a little corn here, or a little corn there, you want to dump out the whole load. Well, you know what? After 30 plus years, it's time to quit babysitting these Christians, and it's time to quit warming their milk. And you need to wake up to the onslaught of that in which what you have created. Especially those that are in their 70s and those that was familiar with the Windmill Ministries missions, but even to this day still refuses to acknowledge the authenticity of it. What other else am I going to think whenever to this day I still don't get no letters at 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255. I still don't have nobody knocking on my door or calling my phone. I still do not see a support team, a Joel Osteen congregation supporting the Windmill Ministries. Now, they're talking about peace, but talk is cheap. You need to put your money where your mouth is. And I've been saying that now for 30 plus years, that even to this day are still being rejected and denied and treated as a red-haired stepchild. An outcast. An outcast. You know why? Because my message was too rich. It's not my message. I'm only preaching the whole Bible and not just bits and pieces of it. And if you can't accept that, like some of the people over in Kenton, Tennessee, that I engaged my life with after the event happened in 1983, that I spent basically a year and a half with a family that I guess to this day are still in denial about accepting the whole truth about the Bible, and still are basically kind of like your climate deniers. Oh, no, we're all going to be gone whenever all that starts taking place. It is taking place. We are seeing the Christians being slaughtered, especially the so-called Christians. It's already taken place. That's kind of like the people being so superstitious about not taking the chip. Oh, we ain't gonna never take that chip. We ain't gonna put no chip in us. No, we ain't gonna take no chip. Guess what? You've already taken the chip, because 99% of us is now walking around with a smartphone, those that can afford it, or an Obama phone, and there's a chip in the phone, and everywhere you go, you carry that chip with you. No, you haven't actually dislodged it in your skin somewhere, but you've still taken the chip. You're still walking around with that phone. So you can't deny that. You've already taken the chip. Just like the church world right now is being slaughtered. They're being ravaged every day because of this resistance movement that began 30 plus years ago. I can actually go back into 1983, which is basically nailing it 40 years ago. And if you look at science from 40 years ago, pertaining to the weather patterns and the depth of our water level in places like the Colorado River and other areas, since 1983, things has dramatically changed up onto this planet. Not just in the human sense, but also in the supernatural sense pertaining to the forces of nature.
Well, Mika, I hesitate to try to sound smart or original in a 30-second soundbite when I've spent 500 pages unpacking this, but the best answer I could try to give you is that at the end of the day, there is a certain ends justify the means mentality that I think informs a lot of voters in this country, a lot of conservative voters in the age of Trumpism, but specific to the evangelical world. When you believe that the country is at the abyss, and you believe that your way of life, your very identity, that it is in the crosshairs, and that you may not have another election in front of you, that this is it, that this is the end, right? It's now or never. Again, I think you feel excused in a way. I write at one point in the book about how the
To where you should
system
feel
for
guilty.
many evangelicals has come to almost feel like Las Vegas, a weekend in Las Vegas for a suburban dad, which is to say that none of the rules of your ordinary life apply, that it's this self-contained escape where you can go and act differently there than you would in any other walk of life. The problem, of course, is that what happens in Vegas in this analogy doesn't stay in Vegas. The rest of the world is watching these evangelical voters. They're watching their behaviors. They're watching the ways in which they have glommed onto this individual and created almost a cult-like following. And they are concluding that they want nothing to do with this
They do not want nothing to do with the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Which tells me that they're hokey pokey. Which tells me that all these people that claim that they have the power, whenever it comes to them being basically slain in the spirit and speaking in unknown tongues, but yet no, you walk into their sanctuary and you see all these young girls, it's got all these youngins, but they don't have no husbands. Truth is in the pudding towards what the church world has done, not just to the Windmill Ministries missions, but to themselves. And they're still being dishonest in not coming clean. And if they think by engaging in another structure towards wanting to follow after some figure pertaining to Donald Trump again, go ahead, go for it. But I guarantee you ain't going to come out no better on the other end than you have already. Why? Because you are not addressing the whole truth versus only bits and pieces of the truth. And until you're willing to accept the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help us God, you're going to continue to be entangled in your own illegitimacies, and you're going to be just like the Bible talks about a dog returning back to its vomit. A lot of people over here in the Western world call it karma. I've even had it expressed to me using the high tide and the low tide, that whatever the tide takes out, it usually brings back in. And in a sense, it's right, because it goes in cycles. That's the reason why Jesus used the expression, or I don't think it was Jesus that used this expression pertaining to the dog. I think it's over in Proverbs or somewhere where it talks about that mankind is just as a dog returning back to its vomit again and again and again. It's a cycle. And if you're not willing to break that cycle, then you're going to continue to keep going right back to the same old thing. Whenever I come back to this neighborhood, I knew, and David, my brother, did too, that the persecution was so strong that even my brother David said, you know what, Jibby, if we was living back in our grandfather days in the early 1900s, somebody would have already come out here with a lynching and already hung us or burn our homes down to the ground. And they would have had. That's how powerful that these demonic spirits was ruling against Dennis James Jackson coming to 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee. But now it was exploding not only in my life, in which I was accustomed to it. I had become accustomed to it ever since day one pertaining to this resistance movement. But now it was flourishing in my brother's life, and he was not adapted to that. Oh yeah, throughout the years he had watched me be persecuted and be lied upon and have all these phony fake charges put on my life and all these lies. He knew my lifestyle. He knew his brother. But he didn't realize the intensity of it until after I come back here. And whenever I did, Lord God, may God have mercy on these people that brought that type of pressure onto an individual that was not built or designed to take on that type of pressure. And that's what David Jeffrey Jackson's peers has to one day look forward to whenever they stand in front of their Creator. And God's going to ask them, how come you done this, and that? And I hope they have a very, very reasonable explanation. How come you didn't support that man? How come you didn't get in behind him? How come you didn't help him? How come you resisted his message? And you know what? I'm not going to be the only one that God questions other people, because God has sent other prophets, other messengers that received the same type of treatment. Now, regardless whether it was over here in the Western world, regardless whether it was over in Europe, regardless whether it was over in the Middle East, regardless whether it was in Russia or wherever, I'm telling you, there's going to be a great deal of people that's going to be judged upon not so much what they done, but what they didn't do. But what they did not do. And of course, you can be like Tony Smith, Jerry Smith's son, that now works for the insurance company and moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, that I worked with for about 5 years, that I seen him basically turn right around and eat his own words in degrading the insurance companies, and then went to work for them. But you can be like Tony Smith and you can say, you know what, Juby, you may be right, but you're not going to cram it down my throat. Okay. All right, I won't cram it down your throat. But I tell you somebody that will, and I tell you somebody that is already. Because every time there's a rape, every time there's a murder, every time a bad episode happens to this country, those people are going to be held accountable for it because they did not support the right causes. They did not support the right movement. I'm not saying that it's all the churches, because there's a lot of good, sincere people out there that have just been blinded. They're ignorant of the fact towards all of this stuff that's happening. But until we see a movement, a true movement, not coming from a politician, but coming from a man of God, of the hour of God, we're still going to be just like a dog returning back to its vomit again and again and again. And I've used this illustration pertaining to a dog chasing after its tail, going around and around in circles. It may be moving. It may be moving. But it isn't going nowhere. That's what has happened to the church here in America for the past 30 plus years, that the core of origin began right here in Northwest Tennessee. You can follow the dots. Kind of like all things lead to the roads of Waco. Well, that was just one vein or one tree limb. There's been many a tree limbs that people have been persecuted on account of. And this was one of them right here. Of the messenger being rejected because his message was too rich or too steep or too serious-minded of the message. So because they didn't like the message, they made the messenger's life miserable. They wanted to destroy the messenger because they thought, if we can destroy this individual, we will destroy his message. They thought the same thing about Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ had a hit on his life basically from the time that he was born. It was King Herod that thought, if I can destroy this individual, I'll destroy the prophecies of this individual. And he went to the extent of actually killing about 5,000, they claim, of his own people, killing basically toddlers firstborns, I think it was from like 2 years old down, or a year old down, that they claim that he killed over 5,000 people of his own people trying to eliminate the prophecy and still did not succeed. Well, you can look at the prophecy pertaining to Moses. They was after Moses. But Moses' mother gave Moses up to going down the canal, and the next thing you know, here come the Egyptians that decided, oh, isn't that a lovely child? And the very child that they raised was the very liberator that was going to liberate God's people from the Egyptians. Do you not see how God works? You can try to resist all you want to resist. You can stand in the corner and say, well, I'm not going to have a part of this. Well, that's fine. That's okay. But guess what? I've been taking notes of all these times that I did receive persecution and all these lies and all these people that's let us down. Just like the courts up here in Weakley County. They'll be held accountable for this. They will be held accountable to the fullest extent of God's law. It may not be in their law. I may not hire an attorney and actually go after them to smear them the way that they need to be smeared, legally speaking. But just because I'm not hiring an attorney doesn't mean that they're still not going to have to pay the piper. You got it. Pay the piper. You see, our courts want their citizens to pay the piper, but then whenever they mess up, they're not willing to pay the piper. To this day, I still have yet to hear any actual remorse coming from Mount Carmel, Waco, Texas authorities or the Oklahoma authorities that allowed for 168 people to be destroyed because of. I still have yet to see clarity in our government making things right. They want to talk the talk about, we're doing everything for the good, for the betterment of the good. Well, it's one thing to talk the talk about talking it, and now let's actually see your actions upon to doing it. I have yet to see any actions pertaining to what went on in Mount Carmel as far as actually seeing charges placed upon people's lives in basically murder charges. Murder charges. Anybody that's willing to go after dim-witted people like that, weak-minded people that was just expecting basically the sky to fall any given moment, doomsday preppers, and tricking them by buying all them guns and then going after them for buying the guns. And once they realized that their plans had been tainted, had been spoiled, they still went ahead and pursued that shakedown. Those are the people that should stand in front of a court somewhere and be held accountable for what they brought upon to the Branch Davidians. But not only are they going to stand in front of the court one day, God's court, but they're going to stand in front of God's court pertaining to it led to the extermination of 168 people 2 years to the date pertaining to the Oklahoma bombing. So if they can live with what their actions have done, that's fine. That's fine and dandy. But I promise you, one day they will stand and they will give an account for what they done by luring in on them people and entrapping them people the way that they did over monetary money, because they had no earthly idea that David Koresh was doing anything illegitimate with sexual enticing favors coming from some of his clergymen or some of the people that was supporting him. I went down there and I investigated that. I spent 3 days and nights on the property and went around in a circle of about a 5-mile area and interviewed some of them that either didn't go to jail or some of them that did. After 20 plus years or 18 and a half years later, they got out of jail. But I went down there and found out the truth towards what happened. In other words, I had to roll up my sleeves and not just go with what the media was telling us, but let's find out. Let's go where the rubber was meeting the road, and let's find out the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And that's what I did. And once I got through with that investigation, then I moved upstream into Oklahoma and done the same thing in that one. And of course, we identified real quick that they was not going to take somebody snooping down their throats in investigating what that they had already convinced their people of. Somebody like me comes along and opens up a brand new can of worms towards, hey, I blowed the whistle in what that they didn't do that they should have done pertaining to the victims and the victims' loved ones that to this day, still does not have true closure in what happened with the Oklahoma bombing. Just like to this day, and even Donald Trump will admit to this, the American people still have not gotten down to the bottom of 9/11. That come from Saudi Arabia that was connecting with the Bush family. To this day, there still hasn't been true closure or clarity of what happened. But it will. It will. It may take the hereafter life before it comes clean on what actually occurred, but I promise you it will come clean.
Christianity that they practice. They want nothing to do with this Christ that they purport to follow. And that is the great tragedy in this, Mika, I would say, is that C.S. Lewis told us in his writings that we know what a crooked line looks like only because we have seen a straight line first.
Exactly.
Those of us who follow Jesus, we know what a straight line looks like.
Exactly.
And this thing over here is not a straight line. And if we can try to get this right and to course correct and hopefully allow the outside world to see who Jesus really is and what Christianity really looks like,
right.
I think they'll recognize that it bears no resemblance whatsoever to what we've seen in recent years.
The new book is entitled The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. It officially goes on sale tomorrow. New York Times bestselling author and staff writer at The Atlantic, Tim Alberta, thank you very much for coming on. Thanks for writing this book.
Thank you for having
Thanks,
me, guys.
Tim.
Appreciate it.
All right, take care.
That would be something that I'd care to get a hold of and actually take a part in understanding some of his theologies or philosophies and everything, because he seemed like a very smart individual. He said from the time that he started this interview, that he actually felt guilty because he can sit by now and see where the church world has corrupted itself. That basically some of the converts let him know that during the time of his own daddy's departure, because his dad was in fact a preacher and he was raised around those type of people. I keep telling people that Dennis James Jackson was supposed to have failed in this entity. And it wasn't just because it was a different message, even though it was a godly message. It wasn't just the fact that he had been basically shunned by his own church community, but basically looking at my dad in how that he turned his back on the Lord and basically abused us and took advantage of us. I was actually supposed to have been a statistic of failure, just like others out there that have basically become a statistic of failure because of the wickedness that has happened to them, that drove them away from the cross rather than it driving them to the cross. And I can vouch for that pertaining to my older brother, because of the harshnesses that was coming from my dad, actually drove my brother away from God, because he started blaming everything on God versus looking at the true identity that it was Lucifer working through his dad that was causing the harm and hurt. That's kind of like my cousin. I just visited him a couple weeks ago over here in a nursing home in Union City. His name is Maxie Jackson. He was the son to Leon and Margaret Jackson. He had a fire in 1983, and it killed his wife, his two stepchildren, and one of his own children by that wife, and his first wife child. His whole family got destroyed. His whole family got destroyed in 1983, and it was absolutely devastating to the whole family. Not just him, but his mother and his father that was living at the time, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, everybody that surrounded Maxie Jackson's life was touched by that. And I think anybody would say the same thing, that if something like that's substantial, where it basically took out a whole family, it will affect people's lives. It will affect people's lives. But 2 weeks ago, I asked Maxie, have you made things right with the Lord? Have you made proper preparations? Do you want to pray? Do you want to read the Bible? No, Dennis, I'm fine. I don't want to talk about it. I'd rather you not even talk about God. No, I don't. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I'll know when it's time. He said, I'll know when it's time for me to get things right with God. But then he brought up this preacher that basically was moonlighting on the people that was working out of Goodyear during one of their strikes that helped Goodyear go out of business. That supposedly this preacher was degrading everybody because they was trying to work 45, 49, 50, 52, 60 hours a week, not reverencing to the Sabbath, of giving God that honor that basically, I guess, choked a great deal of them, including Maxie, that, according to his testimony of what he gave less than 2 weeks ago, blames God. He don't blame the devil. He blames God for everything that occurred in his life, that is still occurring, that had occurred. And so many people are the same way. I mean, ministers that I've talked to wants to blame God because of the tornadoes, wants to blame God because of the lack of rain, wants to blame God because of the fires, wants to blame God because of the hurricanes, wants to blame God because of us being $33 trillion in debt. And I got news for you. God didn't have nothing to do with none of it. God is out to save people, not to perish them, not to bring them to naught. It's the devil that's out to kill, steal, and destroy. Not God. It's the devil that's created all this confusion, not God. These people are mixed up. And they want to say, well, it was retribution coming from God that allowed for those things to happen. Well, you can categorize it any way you want to. Okay, but the bottom line is this: whenever I read the Bible in Revelations, it says that Satan will come down in great wrath because he knoweth his time is short. It don't say he might come down. It don't say he's willing to come down. It doesn't say that he thinks about coming down. It says that Satan, the demonic figure, the supernatural forces, will come down because it knows its time is short due to the fact that it has lost in this competition. It has lost in this battle, in this war, this warfare that now started up there in heaven, that now is happening down here on the planet Earth. And if you're not smart enough to identify that, you're probably going to be like my cousin Maxie, and you're going to blame everything on God, rather than looking at it from a different perspective. Once more, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? It's not what you're looking at, but how that you're looking at it that's going to be a determining factor in whether or not you're true at heart towards taking responsibility for your own actions. And maybe God did allow for that to happen in my cousin's life, but maybe it was because Maxie turned his back on God way before that burn. And I continue to keep saying that bad things happen to good people. You can look throughout the Bible of the people that have been attacked, and I'm just going to use Job as an example. There wasn't nothing wrong with Job pertaining to his relationship with God, but I guarantee you Job went through great sufferings. Jesus went through great sufferings. The disciples of Jesus went through great sufferings, and even to this day, Jesus' people are going through great sufferings. And if you don't believe me, start paying close attention to the news that's happening either to the Ukrainians or to the people over in Israel, Jerusalem. Start looking at the news and seeing how that they're attacked and how that they're being raped and murdered and burnt and set on fire, and babies cut from their stomachs and killed right in front of them. And it all posted on social media platform. That way it can not only affect the people that they're victimizing, but now it can affect their whole family and their friends and their circle of life. If that's not evil, I will kiss your you-know-what and give you 30 minutes to draw up a crowd. That is evil in the fullest form. Whenever you see stuff like that occurring, the church, the corporate so-called church sector here in America has brought this upon the godly and the righteous. And whenever it fell upon the godly and the righteous, it also fell upon the ungodly and those that was perverted or those that was lukewarm. Because it states very, very clearly, in the once more, going back to those first 4 chapters of Revelations, that he will spew thee out of his mouth. He'd rather you either be hot or cold. That if you're lukewarm, he's going to spew you. He's going to allow for certain things to happen because you're lukewarm. Because you're not true. Now, does that mean God actually wants us to be on the cold side? No. He prefers for us to be on the hot side. That was the whole primary purpose for God bringing forth all the prophets, especially bringing forth Jesus Christ, which was God's only begotten Son. For Jesus said, for if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That if you honor me, you're honoring the Father. Well, if you can't honor Jesus, you're not honoring the Father. And if you can't love the individual that you can see and hear, how do you expect that you're truly going to be able to love him who you cannot see? Those are all scriptures, my friends. Those are not words that I just made up. Those are coming from the Bible. That even to this day, I still have just as many people that's either confused are not participants of the Windmill Ministries missions. And I guess it's going to take great horror and sorrow and misery. And we think, well, how much worse can it get? Trust me, it can get a whole lot worse. And I tend to wonder that these very people that are sniggering and laughing, that are being part of the bunch that is ridiculing the true Christians, not just myself, but all of us, are the ones that are bringing it up onto all of us, and we're not smart enough to identify that. We're not intelligent enough to understand that. I have studied my enemy, and I ain't just talking about my recent enemy. I was studying my enemy that entered into my father as he was abusing his family. From I was basically the age of about 8 or 9. From the time we moved to Tennessee and my grandpa died, which was my dad's dad in 1969, that's when my dad changed. And James Robert Jackson was no longer the same James Robert Jackson that started taking out all of his anxieties on his family, using his family as a whipping post because his life was miserable. He was dead set that he wanted to make everybody else's life miserable. Well, what does the Bible say about that? The Bible says that it would have been better for a person to have never known any ways of the church or any ways of the ways of righteousness than to turn from those ways of righteousness, because now it leaves room in that person's soul for 7 more devils. And that person will actually be a meaner person or a crueler person on the last part of their life than they ever thought about on the first part. That's where we're at. God says that he'll give you over to a reprobate mind, allow for you to believe a lie, and to be damned. That's where we're at as a nation. That's the trajectory that we're on. Now, if those words offend you, that means the truth offends you. All these climate deniers, all these election deniers, all these other different deniers towards not wanting to believe the whole Bible and just different pieces of the Bible. And I got news for the Neal family over in Kenton, Tennessee, that I, to this day, still think as much of today as what I did whenever I become acquainted in their lives in 1985, was whenever the Bible study started. It may have been 84. That I cared just as much for them today as what I ever did. But the fact of the matter is, until they're willing to accept the whole truth out of the Bible, that really and truly I don't have nothing to do with, other than me being the messenger of the Bible, until they're willing to accept that, as far as I'm concerned, they've been given over to a reprobate mind to believe a lie and be damned. Because it was them that continued to say, Juby, we're all going to be gone whenever that happens. We're all going to be gone whenever that happens. I couldn't tell you the thousands of times from various individuals, not just the Neal family, but those around here that disputed this message, that told me the same thing. And you know what? To this day, those same people are dying like flies. They're falling into their graves. They didn't see a rapture. Not the type of rapture that they was preaching and teaching on, pertaining to everybody just vanishing from the planet. Boy, that would be nice if it would work out that way. But the way I understand it, there's not going to be but basically 12,000 that's going to be worthy of that, pertaining to the 144,000. 12 tribes at 12,000 equals 144,000 people that's going to be deemed that pleasure of being changed from mortal to immoral in a twinkling of an eye, to the point that every molecule in their body basically is transfigurated from being one thing to another, and they won't have to go through a long process of death. Other than that, the Bible teaches that it is appointed unto all men wants to die. And whenever it says all men, it's talking about mankind. It is appointed to all men wants to die, and then the judgment. But it also teaches that the last enemy that shall be destroyed is the enemy of death. In other words, we have to overcome the fear of death. We have to overcome sin. We have to overcome the lies and the deceitfulness that has been going on, that has put us where we are to this day. That, you know, it's not just me that can see these things, but others as well can too as well. And it's not just Dennis James Jackson that's being persecuted of teaching a righteous message coming from the whole truth rather than just parts of it, but it's thousands of people just like me that are being squandered, smushed, treated as outcast, lied upon, cheated, entrapped. Thousands of us all over the planet are dealing with the same evil entities that now needs to be looked at as a siege, a spiritual siege that has come down, just as the Bible teaches, in great wrath, because it knows it has failed in this competition. And whenever I say it, I'm talking about Lucifer himself, the Antichrist, the false prophet, the Luciferian Lucifer, Lucifer himself, Satan, understands and recognizes and fears and trembles under the name of Jesus, because that's the one that Lucifer is going to have to answer to. But guess what? It's not just Lucifer that's going to have to answer to the Lord Jesus, but it's all of us. It's all of us, because the Bible is very clear in stating that every tongue will profess and every knee will bow in confessing that Jesus Christ was in fact Lord. And if you're not willing to do it in this lifetime, you'll be forced to do it in a lifetime to come. I promise you, you will be forced to do this. And it will make some of you that much more, even more angrier, because you're dead set that you are not going to accept the Lord towards the Lord being the Lord. Because you are so convinced, because you've been deceived, that all this bad stuff that's happening is happening because of God. You're deceived. You're messed up. You've been bamboozled. You've been tricked. But you're not willing to admit to your trickery. You're not willing to admit to your faults. Now, our government over here wants us to be punished severely for anything that we do in violation of their laws. But yet, no, they themselves can break their own laws. And whenever they do get caught, most of them barely get a spank on the back of the hand. They have taken advantage of the system. They have taken advantage of the people. And until the people are willing to wake up to that, and until the godly people are willing to stifle out the fraudulent people, the imposters, we're still going to be just like that dog going around and around in circles, or that animal going back to its vomit again and again and again. And I continue to keep telling people that, and I continue to not get any type of true movement or supporters in this movement. Once more, it's the church world, or the so-called church world, that has now brought this upon the true church world, and they have brought it upon to themselves towards being the hypocrites, and they have brought it upon to the wicked and the demonic of those that could care less about religion. Because if you really get to looking at who actually crucified Jesus, it wasn't the hobo, it wasn't the prostitute, it wasn't the no man's, it wasn't the tramp or the gypsies, or the soothsayers, the fortune tellers. They knew who Jesus was, and they left him alone. It was his so-called own people that rejected him and put him to his death. And that's the reason why I say to this day, people in this particular location in Northwest Tennessee, they won't tell you the truth, but in reality, they wish I and people like me was dead. They do not want to see true Christianity blossom pertaining to the bride of Christ, that's supposed to be properly preparing itself in a righteous, spotless sense, waiting for the bridegroom to come back and take us out of this misery. I'm not seeing that movement. Now, thank God that people such as you just got through listening to is coming forth, because I personally think that this individual, especially with him being raised up in a family setting, I personally believe that he knows exactly what he's talking about, and I think that he can perceive the very things that I'm talking about in basically understanding what has happened here towards the true church being hijacked. The true identity of the true righteous church here in America got hijacked in 1988 whenever 9 tapes went to the White House that should have motivated various people in the White House, but instead they thought that they was going to cover it up, and they thought that they was going to be able to use a smear technique in basically attacking the individuals that's talking to you right now, in the degree that people either look at him towards him being out and out crazy person, or him being basically a fraudulent person, towards him lying, or towards me and people like me being sick and having some sort of mental illness. And the thing about it is, the mental illnesses that has befallen up into our great nation right now is unlike any type of movement pertaining to a pandemic that we have ever seen happen to the American land. That we have ever seen happen to the American land. So in reality, I look forward to one day being able to read this individual's book. That leads me to my final thing that I want to say, that for the past basically since 2016 was whenever I first become accustomed with the new phone technology of today. I have never read a whole book in my entire life other than the King James Version Bible. And in lots of cases, I didn't actually read it, but I had it read to me pertaining to either having cassette tapes or DVD tapes, listening to message, verse after verse after verse. I don't know what minister that it was that come out with the first cassette tapes of the whole Bible. Seems like it may have been PTL or Pat Robinson, may have been Oral Robertson. I don't know who it was. May have been Billy Graham himself, Billy Graham Sr. But that was a major, major stepping stone for me to where I could read or listen to the Bible and understand not just part of the truth, but all the truth. I've never read a book from front to back. Even Jack and Jill. You know, I didn't have a mother that wanted to sit down and read fairy tales to me at night. A matter of fact, whenever I got old enough to get on my own at the age of 15 and a half, for the first time, I went to the dentist office up here in Martin, Tennessee, and had 16 cavities in my head. 16 cavities. You keep in mind, I did not have good parenting leadership. I had just the opposite. I should have been driven further away from the cross like my older brother versus driving me to it. Once more, it's not what you're looking at, but how that you're looking at it. I don't blame James Robert Jackson for the abusiveness that he brought upon to his own family that he loved, because logically, it's not practical for you to destroy something that you love. That's the reason why I say that the ridiculation that surrounds slavery pertaining to back during the days of Confederacy, right before and during the Civil War and after, basically was lies. Because I'm going to say probably 8 out of 10 slave masters took very good care of their slaves. The same way that if you got any practicality about you at all, you're not going to want to bring destruction to your horse, or to your tractor, or to your car, or to your home, or to the loved ones around you. You don't want to bring destruction into their lives. You want to enhance them, support them. You want them to embrace you just like you're embracing them. That way you become a team. That way there's more power in being united than it is divided. So I do not go along with the lies pertaining to slavery. Do I agree that slavery should have remained here on the planet, especially here in America? Absolutely not. I think it never should have been fumigated by their own people over in Africa. It was basically their own people that lied to them, that basically entrapped them and sold them as slaves. It was basically their own people that stabbed their own people in the back. By stabbing them in the back. By selling them to the slave masters over here in America. Was certain slaves treated badly? Absolutely. You got bad and good in everything. And you know what? Those slave masters paid for that. And if they didn't pay for it in this lifetime, I guarantee you they paid for it in a lifetime to come. They paid for it in a lifetime to come. Now, in my grandfather's experiences, that he basically worked as a duty-ator here in Northwest Tennessee for, I think it was a very short length of time, maybe 4 or 5 years, until he went back to being a merchant. Of course, at that time was whenever the 1929 Depression hit, and it wasn't until later he gave up that business because he was driven off into bankruptcy because of so many other people that was basically losing their farms because they couldn't pay their own taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, towards the history of what happened here during the Great Depression. It was my grandfather that took on the responsibilities of taking in a foster child in his latter years, because that was the type of individual that he was. Now, all them people that he hung, does that mean that he was right for hanging them? I can't be the judge of that. But what I can be the judge of, that certain people during that era, I truly believe, was brainwashed, they was bamboozled, and they truly believed that what that they was doing was deserving of justice. Even though you can be sincere and at the same time be sincerely wrong. And I think that only the Heavenly Father is going to be able to judge those occurrences and those people accurately, in knowing the people that was doing it in the name of justice versus the people that was doing it just to get a rise, or just to be able to get some sort of a fancy thrill out of it. Trust me, God the Father knows. Just like I tried to explain to my Aunt Ruth up in Wisconsin, Michigan, that let's just look at 1,000 people that crucified Jesus in that surrounding, in that whole atmosphere of basically being a circus. If you break them down into 3 different measures, a third, a third, and a third, there was approximately 300 people, maybe a little more, that was convinced that what Jesus was getting was in fact deserving of it being justice. There was another third that knew that what was happening to Jesus was incorrect, it was wrong, it was not justice, but they refused to speak up because they knew if they did, they was probably going to receive the same type of punishment. But then there was another third that was so wicked and demonic, they knew that what they was doing was wrong. And their motives was to destroy the messenger because they was not going to accept the message, because the message was contrary of the old Judea laws coming from Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. They actually thought that if we can do away with Jesus, we'll do away with his message. And they may have succeeded in that to a certain degree on the front end. But on the back end, they didn't stop God's messenger pertaining to the message, because that seed has now been planted and it has went around the planet Earth again and again and 1,000 times again. And now we know, most people know about the story in behind Jesus Christ dying for all of man's sins and raising on the 3rd day towards the tomb being empty. Now, just because we know that does not mean that we're acting appropriately up onto that, which goes back to the lukewarmers, which goes back to those that, even though they may not have physically attacked me directly, indirectly, they're just as guilty because they sat idly by and allowed for it to happen. And I'm just not talking about the close neighbors around in this area that knows exactly who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the court system up in Weakley County. I'm talking about Tommy Moore, Judge Pence. I'm talking about Tommy Thomas. I'm talking about prosecuting attorney Johnson, that now is a supervisor in this area that took over the same position as Tommy Thomas. I'm talking about Mike Wilson. I'm talking about various law enforcement people, either in Martin, Tennessee, Kenton, Tennessee, or let's just sum it all up in this particular area. They knowed what that they had done was wrong. But now, get them to move up onto it is another complete different issue. Just like the people out in Oklahoma. They know that now it was more involved other than 3,000 pounds of manure that killed 168 people that day. And God only knows that the people that got affected, probably thousands, because of that disaster that hit. Now, do we hear the authorities trying to bring closure into those people's lives? Do we hear the truth coming out in regards to the whole truth? I haven't heard it yet if it's happened. I have heard of them now leaning more towards expressing to the general public that yes, there was more to the death of their loved ones or the victims other than 3,000 pounds of manure, that now they're leaning towards that there was some inside job of somebody planning explosion devices on various columns, that whenever explosion number 1 went off, it went off at the same time explosion number 2 went off. That is theoretically impossible, because David Koresh did not use electronics or shortwave radio to detonate the 3,000 pounds of manure, fertilizer. That was all done on a primitive scale. Just like him mixing up the ammonium nitrate with all the fuel. That was all done on a primitive level scale. there was actually so much smoke going into the fuselage that David Koresh had already done set out that he had to basically panic by putting whatever it was. I guess it was some sort of a detonator cord, or maybe it was a dynamite cord, whatever you want to call it, that he had lit, but because it was so smoky in there, he had to put it out because he couldn't see, and it was choking him up towards him driving the automobile. Besides that, why would have David Koresh wanted to have taken that automobile, that Ryder truck, and parked it up in the lower corridor of that building where the basement is, where all the cars parked, if he knowed that there was already explosions planted on all the columns? It just so happens he misjudged the distance, and the truck was 3 inches higher and would not go under the viaduct there in the lower part of the basement. That's the reason why he had to go to Plan B and park the vehicle in front of the federal building versus parking it underneath the federal building, which tells me that if he already knowed that there was explosions planted on various columns, he wouldn't have been even. Why do you want to put a Ryder truck with 3,000 pounds of manure under the same building that you know that's got explosives tied to each one of the columns down there? He didn't. He didn't know. That's the reason why my theory fits more of acceptances towards basically somebody within that 51-day standoff. Somebody made a telephone call to somebody and said, you know what, we're going to end this one way or the other. And that's whenever the whole concept of their motives changed down with the standoff in Waco from a rescue mission to a doomsday mission. Somebody brought in about 4 boxes of dynamite that was supposed to have been used on the Davidians. It just so happens the tank, along with 90 cartridges of tear gas that went off into that building for almost 7 hours, that created a towering inferno that they didn't have to use the dynamite on. But the people that brought the dynamite in got paranoid and got to thinking, my God, how are we going to be able to get this stuff out of here? We brought it in, how are we going to be able to get it out? And they throwed a sheet over the boxes that was probably in some sort of a storage room somewhere and said to themselves, we'll get to it later. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and the next thing you know, months turned into 2 years. And the explosion outside caused the explosion inside that detonated, that left a crater probably about the size that you're looking at right there on TV, where the actual building stood, that basically the building blowed up from the inside out, that throwed the debris back towards the fertilizer truck. That is theoretically impossible. Theoretically impossible, because if it was only the Ryder truck that done it, all the debris would have been in the opposite direction towards the explosion blast. So what that I'm telling people about is in fact true, but do I hear the authorities coming forth and acknowledging this? Do I hear the United States government intervening in bringing closure to these people's lives? No. Just like I do not see a movement of various people coming and saying, you know what, Dennis, we're going to support you in the Windmill Ministries. We believe in the things that you're teaching and telling people about. Once more, talk is cheap. And it's basically a bunch of hot air whenever people in America get to talking about peace. Yeah, peace sounds like a noble word. Kind of like grace, justice, clarity, liberty, noble, things that are noble. All of them are nice words, but they're just words. What did Jesus say upon to our faith? That faith without works is dead. I've been working for the past 30 plus years towards uplifting God and God's Son, not degrading God and God's Son. If I was degrading God and God's Son, then I would have been a blasphemer. You see, that was the thing that they accused Jesus of. They said, you have committed blasphemy because you are claiming to be something that we know that you're not. And I got news for those people that are going to stand trial one day in the supernatural world. It was not Jesus that was committing blasphemy, but it was rather the holy men, the righteous men, the Jews, those that professed that they already had a sense of religion, the Pharisees, the Philistines, the Roman soldiers, the Roman government, King Herod, Pilate. It was those people that committed blasphemy because Jesus was in fact real. And Jesus was the very thing that Jesus was telling people that he was. Undebatable. Proof is in the pudding. But do I still see a movement here in Northwest Tennessee? No. No. And that speaks volumes about how sorry the people are that was engaged in this movement going all the way back into the late 80s. It speaks volumes about those people. No ifs, ands, buts about it. It speaks volumes about those people.
Broke the ceasefire originally. So if from the Israeli perspective and from America's perspective as well, in Western Europe, et cetera, people understand that, if you're looking at root causes of this current conflict, it goes back to the breaking of a ceasefire with Hamas's invasion. But, the odd phenomenon here, and it hasn't been discussed enough, I don't think, in the media, is that all along the way since October 7th, Hamas's leaders and spokespeople have been saying that various language you hear. October 7th was just a dress rehearsal. We're going to keep doing this again and again and again. People who understand Hamas understand that its goal is the destruction of the state of Israel. So obviously, if you're an Israeli leader or you're a supporter of Israel like Joe Biden is, you look at Hamas and say, there's day-to-day issues you could possibly negotiate with, but this group is very, very plain in its language. Its goal is to do this again if it's given the chance. So therefore, you find,
Jeffrey, the leader said we're going to do this again, where every day is going to be October the 7th.
Right. And so the goal of Hamas is to keep drawing Israel into Gaza. I mean, it's a kind of it's very hard sometimes for the American mind to get around Hamas's tactics. But as one former Israeli prime minister once said, the Israeli goal should be to limit the number of Palestinian casualties because Hamas's goal is to maximize the number of Palestinian casualties. Now, that's a reversal of the usual way things work in warfare. You, as the leader of a group, are supposed to try to limit the number of people of your group who get killed or injured. But it's in Hamas believes that it's in its best interest to maximize that. And, of course, the challenge to Netanyahu, and I think this is where that dialogue between Biden and Netanyahu is never ending, is don't give Hamas what it wants, but at the same time, you have to recognize that Hamas is not, you're not going to sit down at a negotiating table and come to a peace deal with a group that says over and over again, oh, as soon as we can, we're going to kill you. That's the difficulty of this situation.
Well, and their founding documents say their goal is to kill Jews and to wipe Israel from the face of the earth.
And then go after America.
And as we've been saying here from the beginning
That's
of
what they've been
story,
saying.
From the day, the Monday after this attack, we said the world needs to understand, for Hamas, a dead Jew is a victory. A dead Palestinian is a victory. Actually, what we found since then is that actually for Hamas, a dead Palestinian, they figure that's 10 times the value of a dead Jew for their own purposes. So when you see the systematic raping of women And most of us, I think, figured this out from the very beginning. You see the torture, the systematic raping of women. It's all broadcast live. It's meant to shock Israel into going into Gaza. And please, I don't want any lectures from anybody who's too stupid to not understand this, that may be watching going, oh, this is the Palestinian civilians' fault. I didn't say that. This is Hamas's fault, because they use Palestinian civilians as human shields, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Talk to that, but also I bring that up this morning again because, Elise, I can't believe, I'm stunned by the international response or the lack of outrage to Jewish women being systematically raped and tortured and killed and paraded around Palestinian towns like they're just meat, or like they're carcasses, to be pulled apart and savagely attacked in life and in death.
They're trophies. To them, they're trophies. It's the same thing as a hunter over here in America killing a 12-point buck deer, and then hiring somebody to basically, I forgot the name of it now, the process, that way they can hang their deer head on the wall, and all their buddies can come in and say, oh yeah, I killed that deer. That was me that killed that deer. Those are my bragging rights. That's the same differences of what Hamas is doing over there, wanting to have bragging rights. That way they can parade around by telling everybody, look what we've done, look what we've accomplished. It's evil in the truest form. And if people can't recognize that and identify that, then probably they themselves are either blinded, incapable, or they themselves are evil.
And this isn't a complex issue to talk about and to, decry and to say not okay. The fact that there's any equivocating on this whatsoever is stunning. And it shows that the politicization of so much of the lens at which we look through war, which there are things in war that are black and white, the killing of innocent civilians, the use of rape as a tool of war, the sexual violence that has been inflicted upon Israeli women deliberately. It really is shameful that it's come to this, where even sexual violence in war is being equivocated.
And it is.
So Vice President Kamala Harris discussed the Israel-Hamas war with Middle East leaders, including Egypt's president and the King of Jordan, at a global climate summit in Dubai over the weekend. Here's what she said about what the future will look like in Gaza following the war.
I've had a number of in-depth conversations with Arab leaders here in Dubai. Specifically, I proposed 3 areas of focus. 1, reconstruction. The international community must dedicate significant resources to support short and long-term recovery in Gaza. 2nd, security. The Palestinian Authority security forces must be strengthened to eventually assume security responsibilities in Gaza. Until then, there must be security arrangements that are acceptable to Israel, the people of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, and the international partners. The Palestinian Authority must be revitalized, driven by the will of the Palestinian people, which will allow them to benefit from the rule of law and a transparent, responsive government.
Jonathan O'Meara, I think it's been fascinating over the past several days, past week perhaps, watching the Biden administration, seeing how Kamala Harris is being sent out, the messages that she's sending, obviously, that shows, again, the complexity of this issue, but also the two sides of the Biden administration is dealing with. One, saying, we will support Israel. We are going to support Israel in this heinous terror attack. And we're going to be with them as they try to root out and destroy Hamas. And at the same time, we are going to put pressure, as you've reported time and again, and as Kamala Harris has talked about, and as we saw the vice president this weekend huddling with Arab leaders saying, we're going to do everything we can to put pressure on the Israeli government to understand we support them in this endeavor. We will not back down, but we expect them to, one, limit civilian deaths as much as humanly possible while on their mission to destroy this terror group that terrorized the Israeli people on October 7th. And two, look over the horizon to a two-state solution. And Netanyahu, who has spent the past decade undermining let's just say it right here, a corrupt Palestinian Authority, but Netanyahu, who's worked overtime undermining any Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, he and the Israeli government need to look to the future of a two-state solution. And this corrupt Palestinian Authority needs to be replaced by a younger, more representative Palestinian Authority. And that's not going to be an easy task, but it is interesting. It's what has to be done. And it is interesting that Kamala Harris is going out there and playing such an active role here in a two-part process in this delicate diplomatic dance that the Biden administration is performing, in my opinion, quite extraordinarily.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult and challenging moment for the administration, trying to manage all of these different aspects of this crisis and war. You're right. The president had been to this COP environmental conference the last 2 years. This year, sending the vice president instead. And her message there was to do two things. First, as you noted, to say, look, we're with Israel. What happened on October 7th, deserves and demands retaliation. But she was pretty firm with a brushback pitch to Netanyahu, both in the public remarks, some of which we just played, but also in these private meetings. I've talked to U.S. officials who were in these meetings, who have received readouts of these meetings. They've had very candid conversations from the vice president, showing the U.S. breaks with Netanyahu's administration on two separate fronts. One, what they see as a post-Gaza, where Netanyahu has said, we might occupy Gaza after this war comes to an end. And President Biden has made clear, no, that's a bad idea. The vice president this weekend to these Arab leaders reiterated that and says, no, we need to figure a different solution and you all need to be involved. Also made clear that as the two-state solution is the future, a revitalized Palestinian Authority would play a role on that. Netanyahu needs to get on board. And lastly, and most importantly, probably the strongest language yet we've heard, Joe and Mika, from this administration, delivered by the vice president, about saying Israel needs to limit the civilian casualties, that there's too many. The toll has been too high with Palestinians who have died so far. And now that Israel has moved into the southern part of Gaza, which is where so many people have fled from the north, and it's so densely populated, and that bombardment has begun in earnest, there's real fears in the U.S. about the number of civilians who could get killed in the days ahead.
So Jeffrey, talk about this extraordinarily difficult balancing act that the Biden administration, as let's just say it, the guarantor of Israel's security right now, and the one country that is standing shoulder to shoulder with it. Talk about the extraordinarily difficult diplomatic situation the Biden administration is facing, and the best way forward when. Again, you're balancing the ability of Israel to destroy Hamas, but also to limit civilian lives and look toward the two-state solution.
If I can add to the question, the fact that the big news that came out late last week about the 40-page document, the warning that Israel had about this, that they ignored.
Yeah.
So here are three things that the Biden administration, Vice President Harris, can't say or won't say publicly. One, putting reconstruction money on the table right now is sort of cart before the horse. It's like, if you don't get rid of Hamas, there'll be another war, and the buildings that you're rebuilding will get knocked down again. The second is they know that there's no Palestinian Authority worth its name. It's right now it's a sclerotic and corrupt organization in the West Bank that that the president of the Palestinian Authority is 87 years old and completely ineffective. So there is no credible Palestinian leadership that's an alternative to Hamas right now. So that's the problem. And then the third part is they're dealing with a government, Netanyahu's government, they don't like. Actually, right? They don't trust and they don't believe is competent.
And coming up on Morning Joe.
You look at what's happening to our country. We cannot let it happen any longer. And one of the other things I'll do, because, you know, you're supposed to not be involved in that. You just have to be asked by the governor or the mayor to come in. The next time, I'm not waiting.
It's awful what's going on right now.
By missiles, as the Carney responded to their distress calls, was forced to shoot down 2 more incoming drones. Joining us now, NBC News national security and military correspondent Courtney Kube. Courtney, what more do we know about this?
Yeah, I mean, the Houthis seem to wage this war against commercial shipping on Sunday. And I have to say, Mika, this is something that they have been warning about for the last several weeks. This isn't the first time that we've seen them try to fire projectiles at ships in the Red Sea and up in towards the Bab el-Mandeb. So, as you said, yesterday morning, Sunday local time, Houthi rebels began firing missiles at 3 separate commercial ships. The USS Carney, a U.S. Navy warship, was in the region at the time. And each time one of these ships was fired on, and as you mentioned, in several cases, even struck by these missiles, the Carney responded. As they were responding, Houthi rebels also fired off some what the U.S. military calls one-way attack drones. These are drones that are generally laden with explosives. And the idea is they come in and they just strike into any kind of a target. In this case, the Carney was in the path of these drones. In all 3 cases, the U.S. military making the decision with their right of self-defense to take those drones down. But it was a pretty remarkable afternoon, Mika, because we saw the succession of missiles and drones over the course of hours. Now, as I said, the Houthis have been warning that they would do this, and they specifically have said that they would target Israeli ships. Now, another thing, you've been talking for the last 15 or 20 minutes now all about Israel here. One thing that our viewers should know is that during this pause or ceasefire that occurred last week in Israel and in Gaza, despite the fact that these other Iranian-backed groups stopped attacking bases in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis, also backed by Iran, have continued their targeting of ships. They've tried in several cases to launch missiles towards southern Israel. So despite the fact that the other groups stopped throughout the truce, the Houthis continued. Now, one thing that I was really struck by in the course of reporting on this yesterday is the Pentagon saying that they believe that Iran has supplied the Houthis with this. We know, of course, that Iran in the past has funded, trained, supplied the Houthis, but they specifically said in their statement last night that the Houthi rebels have been funded by Iran. And literally just moments ago, the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman completely denied that, Mika.
Coming up, drunk and asleep on the job, the New York Times has a startling look at air traffic controllers pushed to the brink. We'll talk to one of the officers.
It's a tinderbox waiting to go off over there. And before it's all said and done with, Iran will be in the middle of all of it if they're not.
Let me just say, because this is really important. This is not partisan, right? This is not about Republican ideas, conservative ideas versus liberal ideas or democratic ideas. This is about standing up for democracy. This is not about Republican ideology. This is about Trump's predisposition toward autocracy.
Well, and the thing is, I mean, you look at Ann Applebaum, a conservative. You look at Tom Nichols, a conservative. You go down the list, the Kay Poppins, a conservative. There's so many of these people who have probably voted Republican in the majority of their elections throughout their lives. And Elise Jordan, I would just guess that you would be one of those as well, like me. But when you look at a Republican nominee, potential Republican nominee that's talking about terminating the Constitution. He said, terminate the Constitution, arrest political opponents using the Justice Department, assassinate generals that weren't sufficiently politically loyal to him, saying that he was going to take the FCC and bring it in to the White House and he would decide what networks were on and what networks were not on. Continually talking about trying the leaders of Comcast for treason and shutting down this network? Because I don't know. Doesn't like Joy Reid. I'm not sure. Maybe it's Lawrence O'Donnell that irks him. But yeah, his answer is, as next president of the United States, I'm going to try them for treason. This is, again, for me, it's just staggering that people that I know, people that I grew up with, could still even consider voting for this autocrat.
Joe, I'm glad you went through the litany of authoritarian intentions that Donald Trump has for a second term, because any one of those items, just as a standalone, is jaw-dropping and unacceptable and illiberal, and put together as a whole, it's so disturbing, and is why this Atlantic essay collection is so important. What you see of Trump big picture, though, all of these ideas that he's pushing, it's the reasonable outcome of the move into political extremism and how Donald Trump is trying to radicalize his followers to the extent that he can do pretty much whatever he wants to. And so far, he's been pretty successful in that there's some polling that suggests that 1 in 5 Americans, that they are radicalized to the state of an extremist by the same indicators that we would have used when we polled post 9/11 extremism and terrorism in the Middle East. And it's incredibly scary that so much of the country is being divided in this way for political expediency and for power. And that's why it's important for those who do care about democratic institutions to keep speaking out.
And we have learned over the years to take Trump at his word, and that some of his followers will do what he says. Over the weekend in Iowa, he asked for his followers to go into deep blue big cities, Philadelphia and the like, and watch the polls to protect the vote, which sure sounds like voter intimidation to me, Jeffrey. So talk to us, if you will, though. There's so many of the guardrails, not just within an administration, but within our democracy, within our society, have fallen away since 2016. Trump has plowed through a number of them. And yes, the courts in 2020 held barely. But talk to us about the real threats that if he wins, and if he wins again and assumes power again, what is left to really stop him from being, or could be, a borderline dictatorship?
Right. You know, in the first term, there are a lot of people in government who held on. Right, held on in their jobs, the Justice Department, the State Department, Defense Department, and so on. Right, but in a plausible second term, I think that what you'll see is a direct attack very early on the civil service, on the idea of apolitical government service, right? And B, a lot of people who would gum up the efforts by Trump and Trump's people to subvert democracy will just simply quit in disgust or horror or whatever you want to call it from places like the Justice Department and so on. So once Look, as President of the United States, you are the de facto chief law enforcement officer of the United States, right? You appoint the Attorney General. The idea of Donald Trump under 91 felony counts right now, facing 91 felony counts at this moment, returning to a role as chief law enforcement officer is absurd, obviously. But here we are. And so the number one goal, the first goal, before immigration, before everything else, right? The first goal is to make sure that the mechanisms of government can't be used to prosecute Trump or his allies, right? So it's going to be a direct frontal assault on the independence of the Justice Department and by extension the independence of the entire judicial process. You know, there's not a lot to do when you have somebody who is autocratically minded. And again, remember, this is the key difference. This is not going to be a situation where, as in the first round, he brought in people like Jim Madison, Rex Tillerson, and John Kelly, and so on, right? The adults. No more adults. Right. They're starting with Stephen Miller could wind up being the chief of staff of the White House. We don't know. And so the point is that they've been working for years to plot their revenge. And that's what the David Fromm's piece in this issue is about, the revenge presidency. That's what this is.
Yeah. And again, you say this is not Republican or Democratic. David Fromm. I mean, George W. Bush a speechwriter, a guy who was sufficiently hated by the American left in a past life. I mean, it's
But a lovely guy. Lovely guy.
Lovely guy. We love him. I'm just saying, all of these people, so many of these people that you were writing, that are writing in this piece, proving that it's not a Republican or a Democratic piece, are people that the American left used to, we'll just say, did not tolerate very well. And I do want to say also, I get it. It's very interesting. I got a call on Friday from somebody who said, I feel like I'm your spudsman because anytime people are angry at Morning Joe, they call me. And I said, well, who would ever be angry at Morning Joe? Well, you're beloved by everybody. And this person said, well, this was somebody on the left who was very angry that you had Santorum on to talk about PEPFAR. I said, well, we had him on because he supports PEPFAR. It's like, it's preaching to the audience you want to reach. But then the second thing was, he said, I said, well, who else would ever call you and say they don't like Morning Joe? And he said, well, most of the complaints from people who think that you are too anti-Trump. And Jeffrey, I asked this question, and I'm deadly serious here. When you have somebody that says, he writes it down on Truth Social, that he wants to terminate the Constitution, that he wants to jail political opponents. Let me say this again. This is not Trump hatred. This is using Trump's words, just like saying he was going to terminate Roe v. Wade. When you have somebody who's running for office that said they want to terminate the Constitution, they want to jail political opponents, they want to execute generals who are insufficiently loyal. They want to create mass internment camps to send immigrants there. They want to take networks off the air that are insufficiently loyal and try their executives for treason. That's what he says. How am I being too difficult? How are you being too difficult? How is anybody who loves American democracy being difficult by pointing out the danger that is in front of all of us if this guy gets back into the White House?
You know, I'm about to engage in a bit of constructive media criticism here, and which is the following. You know, we're so inured to his statements that we tend to ignore them. But I think that every time he says, we'll use the General Mark Milley issue, right? He should be tried for treason. That should be banner headlines the next day. The former president says chairman of the Joint Chiefs should be tried for treason, right? When he talks about dismantling the Constitution, that should be banner headlines. That should lead the news. That should be everywhere.
Jeffrey,
we're sleepwalking. It's a sleepwalking, as Liz Cheney says.
Why is it not, Jeffrey? And why is it that when Hillary Clinton says the word deplorable in a speech, it's banner headlines for a month, it seems? When Donald Trump uses Nazi terminology to degrade human beings, uses vermin, you hardly hear anything about it. Why is that, Jeffrey?
I think it's normalization. I think it's this process where one of the great attributes of human beings is that we can get used to anything, right? And so we got used to this, and we just accepted it as background noise. I mean, he does have this particular superpower in that he goes further than anybody in rhetoric, and we kind of go, yeah, it's just Donald Trump, and I think we have to reverse that and just say, no, this is a former president of the United States. Look, if a former president, if Barack Obama, if George W. Bush said the things as a former president, not running for president again, said the things that Donald Trump said, we would have huge stories every day about former president loses mind. Right? You know, and says this. And meanwhile, Donald Trump is the putative nominee for the presidency, and here we are, you know, and we act like it's normal.
Coming up, the last words. Lawrence O'Donnell joins our political roundtable. We'll talk about this week in presidential politics and his own work, giving back to a very good cause. That discussion tops our fourth hour when Morning Joe comes right back.
We're going to end it there. It's been a lot of stuff said this morning on the news. I really enjoyed the spirituality part of the minister talking about the book coming out. we just need to continue to be in prayer, pray for one another, pray for Jerusalem, pray for the elderly, pray for the sick, pray for the needy, pray for our great nation, pray for our military, and pray that God will bless our military and bless our great nation, that we will see a great revival. Thank you. God bless. And good luck to all of us. Shalom.